"Get up!" Salvador's gruff voice commanded as the point of his boot drove into her leg. Rachel drew back her legs and opened her eyes to gaze about in shock as she found herself leaned back against one of the blossoming trees in the inner sanctum of Rekos. Salvador stood over her with crossed arms and an annoyed expression, which transformed into a grin as he saw how scared and disoriented she was. Rachel unclenched her fists and stood up from her place, ignoring Salvador. He unfolded his arms and placed one of his hands gingerly on her back, indicating the other forward toward the castle. "Come, my dear Justine has drawn you a bath." And although Rachel was against preparing herself in any way for being presented to the Dark Lord later that evening, she could not deny that the idea of a warm bath persuaded her onward. And in a small room just beside the door to her chamber, Justine stood beside a massive tub of steaming water, waiting with soaps and wash rags. With a sly grin, Salvador stated that he would go, but he would be back later, and the words sounded more like a threat than a promise. But with him gone, a smile appeared on Justine's face, and she offered for Rachel to take her bath in peace while she guarded the doorway from the other side. Trusting her newfound friend, Rachel peeled away her traveling clothes and found her way to the welcoming steaming tub. The hot water soothed some of her fear and anxiousness from her, and after some time, she almost began to feel at peace. But in the back of her mind there was a lingering fear. She knew that, this evening upon his return, Rachel would be presented as a gift to the Dark Lord. She wondered in terror and anger what awaited her, swearing to make his time with her as miserable as she possibly could. But her defiance of vain was matched equally with the fear of what this notorious Lord of Darkness would be like, look like, and how the King of Evil would react to her defiance. But to her relief, Justine's voice interrupted these thoughts to announce that it was time for her to dress and begin readying herself. Time had passed so quickly, but the cold water of the bathtub told her that she had been in there for some time. So, reluctantly leaving the comfort of the washroom's privacy, Rachel reached for her things to dress, only to find that they were gone. And in their place was a new set of clothes. Rachel's tone was poisonous as she raised her voice to Justine, who still stood on the other side of the door, to ask what had become of her things. Justine could only apologize, but reassured her that these clothes were far more dignified than the ones Salvador had left for her. And to her relief, Justine had been right. Holding it up, the elegantly soft shade of brown fabric reached all the way to the ground and rested properly at the neckline. The sleeves were a lighter fabric, almost a shroud of golden brown glistening streams, and the same material trailed down behind her in a glorious train. Grateful for this unexpected consideration, Rachel timidly thanked her friend on the other side of the door. And Justine smiled slightly to herself, wishing the best for Rachel, hoping with all of her heart that the master would be pleased and treat her well. A trail of small buttons rose from the back of the dress beneath the gold train, and Rachel began the task of buttoning them. But finding it too difficult, she asked for Justine's help. And as she opened the door, she was delighted to see how gorgeous she was, and Justine was glad she had obeyed Salvador's orders to dispose of Rachel's traveling dress and cloak. She began at once to aid Rachel with buttoning up the back of her dress, but in her efforts, she had neglected to keep close watch of the door. Navigating as if by instinct through the dim passages of the fortress, Salvador came to stop before the doorway of the washroom and lingered there. He was content to find that Justine had been successful in improving Rachel's appearance, and noted to himself how she was beginning to look like a princess again. Her long, smooth brown hair draped down her shoulders, and she held herself in a confident poise as Justine finished buttoning the last pearl bead. Salvador grinned to himself, leaning against the door frame as he watched the interesting little spectacle. But Rachel could sense a presence watching them, and turned her head to offer a bitter glare. He smiled wildly and stepped forward toward her, and Justine scuttled toward the doorway, vanishing before Rachel could beg for her to stay. But she concealed her fear and met his eyes with courageousness as she stated, I don't know what you're expecting from me when you present me to your master, but I'm no one's property, and I have no intention of staying here any longer than it takes me to demand my freedom from him." She said this with an intense bitterness. His temper pushed beyond controlling. A swift blur of motion ended in a violent crack as the back of his hand met with her cheek. She gasped and drew back, clinging to the stinging flesh which reddened painfully. For a moment, Salvador stood there and did not move even to breathe. He seemed to be processing what he had just done, and at once his arms fell to his side as his eyes revealed his astonishment. Moving closer, he lifted his hand and delicately grazed her bruised face with his fingertips. But she pulled away from him, wiping away the sensation of his touch. Shaking his head distantly, he motioned toward the doorway without a word and led her out into the main chamber. Through the dim hall, he brought her to a door on the east side of the large room, and placing a hand on either side of the doors, he pushed them open. The low whoosh of air from the doors caused the hem of her dress to flutter as she followed Salvador into the dim chamber, which she realized was a massive dining hall. A long mahogany table stood in the center of the room and was garnished with the most splendid-looking foods. But despite her hunger and the lure of such an incredible feast, her focus was not on the table, but on the figure sitting at the far end of it. Even in that faint red glow of the candlelight, which danced off of the stone walls and the lofty ceiling, she could see him perfectly clear. Reclined slightly against the backing of his high wooden chair sat the man she had been raised to fear, the embodiment of darkness. Hollow black eyes followed her movements from behind the bridge of his fingers, partially obscuring the burn of the seal of exiles on his cheek. His coal black hair was brushed neatly off of his face, drawing definition to the firm lines and muscles of his jaw. And with a build so powerful, she did not doubt that even the ancient mighty kings of lore would have cowered at his feet, and Rachel could sense, even from the doorway, that Devaine's very essence radiated the authority he wielded over the realm of shadow. Darkness coursed through his veins and descended into the empty blackness of his attentive stare. His broad shoulders, clad in a black waistcoat over a silk-white poet's shirt, were rested easily back against his chair as she entered the room. For a moment, he made no attempt to move to greet her, but as their eyes met, something in him suddenly changed, and she watched as he bolted up from his chair, his hands resting flat on the tabletop with a resounding thunder. He seemed to tremble, and he gazed at her with doubt building in his eyes, and after a few moments, he lowered his head and muttered something to himself. He had been mistaken, and his heart sank. Rachel watched in terror as this ominous and deific figure watched her from the other side of the table. But after a moment, he returned to his chair with a blank expression as he regained his composure, reclining back again and gripping the arms of the chair with tightening fingers.
"You are the princess,"
he said softly, more to remind himself than to ask her. "I am," she replied in a voice shakier than she would have liked. He nodded silently, gazing off at nothing in particular as though his mind were somewhere else. But Salvador stirred slightly from behind Rachel and caught Devaine's attention. With a swift nod of his head, the Dark Lord summoned Salvador closer, and as though he had practiced the motion for ages, Salvador snatched up the basin from the table and poured the contents into his master's chalice, which rested an arm's length from the silent figure. Devaine lifted his eyes to Rachel and motioned with a regal hand for her to come closer, and Salvador drew out the chair at Devaine's right side for her. "I have not come here to—" But the sharpness of his gaze as he drove a finger violently in the direction of her chair convinced her to save her grievances for later. She felt his harsh black eyes following her movements as she drifted across the room, and was relieved to see them soften as she sat down beside him with no further argument. But there was a troubled look in his eyes as he silently observed her, and she realized that he was staring at the mark on her cheek where Salvador had struck her. Rachel rubbed the sore spot with her hand, turning her eyes away, and the Dark Lord did not inquire what the cause was. Lifting his chin to return his attention to Salvador, he nodded deeply again, and the rogue prince began to fill the glass at Rachel's place. But as he did, the offensive smell reached her nose and she cringed. The hushed figure seated beside her saw the disgust in Rachel's face, and inwardly, Devane smiled. Snatching up her chalice, Devane slung the liquid out of it, and dark red pools splattered onto the smooth stone floor. Salvador looked somewhat annoyed for a moment, but a sly grin from his master caused him to chuckle. Rachel watched as Devane smiled up at his faithful servant, full red lips creeping back over pearl-white teeth, which looked oddly sharp from where she was sitting. And the Dark Lord sensed her observations as she stared intently in his direction. So he darted his head to catch her gaze, and he had expected her to look away, but she did not. She glared back into his hollow eyes fearlessly, though inside she was bursting with an emotion somewhere between terror and anger. His smile eased to a calm expression, and his eyes lowered to the chalice he still held in his hands. Resting it down for a moment, he leaned forward to snag something out of a nearby bowl. Rachel recognized it as he rested back in his chair, and saw that he was holding one of the fruits which grow in the caverns just outside of the fortress. She tilted her head with a slight interest, and he glanced up at her again as he turned the small red fruit over in between his powerful hands. His fingernails found the crease in the fruit where it had grown on the tree, and in one swift motion, he split the fruit in half between his hands. A stream of juice began to run down both hands as he held the two pieces of fruit over the chalice and clenched his fists tightly. Reddish-purple juice gushed from both halves, and soon the chalice was filled nearly to the brim. Hurling the two crushed pieces across the table, they landed expertly into an empty dish, and Rachel watched as Devane retrieved a small silver saucer and opened it, revealing that it was filled with sugar. A spoonful was mixed in carefully to her cup, and he did not meet her inquisitive eyes until he had finished. And when he had finished, he held out the silver cup to her, his hands still dripping and the silky sleeves of his poet shirt stained red. Rachel took the chalice from his hands and made no attempt to hide her disgust over what she had just seen. But knowing better than to argue over something so trivial, she raised the chalice to her lips and took a hesitant sip. Devane watched intently as she lowered her cup, and a slight look of surprise appeared on her face. He grinned in satisfaction and took up his own goblet, bringing it to his lips as he tilted it back. He drained the cup in 3 deep gulps. Setting the now empty goblet down, he sighed and rested against the backing of his chair, glancing over to his guest, who was now taking a full swig from her cup, watching him cautiously over the brim. He took a moment to admire the way she clung preciously to it, as though afraid she were going to break it. His hands wandered back to his own empty glass, and he passed it slowly back and forth between them as he turned his thoughts over in his mind. But Rachel's movements drew his attention as she set her cup down on the table and turned in her chair to face him. "Now may I speak?" she asked, with no small amount of scorn. Passing his chalice back and forth between his hands silently, he pursed his lips and nodded deeply. With a slight sigh of relief, she began to speak. "I was taken here against my will, forced to bathe and preen and dress. My traveling clothes were stolen from me. I am forced to meet with you, and I have done so with no argument. So now, I would like to be set free." The movements between his hands halted, and he lifted his eyes to meet hers, the low tone of his voice sounding cold as ice as he said, "You sound determined." "I would not be sitting here beside you if I was not determined," she said bluntly, before realizing her mistake. He placed his goblet down on the table and stared off straight ahead, his jaw tensing as he asked, "Am I so vile to you, princess?" The color drained from her face as she realized she had just insulted the king of evil, and in a blur, she saw him bolt up from his chair and take hold of her arms, pulling her over his shoulder in a violent heave. Beating her fists into his back and kicking wherever her feet could find, Rachel tried to break free, but he was far stronger than her, and he kept her still as he bashed open the dining room door with his foot, speeding past Salvador, who looked on in bewilderment. Another door split open, and then another, and Rachel watched as the hallway passed by hazily. And then they were out in the caverns, the darkness and bitter cold greeting her before her eyes fully adjusted. The sound of Devane's raging footsteps thudding heavily on the wooden planks of the pier, which stretched out over the surface of the murky water, resounded like thunder. And then, in a jolting stop, he tore her off of his shoulder. They were at the far end of the pier, which ended abruptly with a steep drop over the water, and Devane shoved her toward the edge, holding her with one arm to keep her from falling. She scratched and clung to the tense muscle as she found herself dangling over darkness. The water below, though hidden by shadows, sounded much more violent than the water at the shore, and churned with the promise of rapids below. Devane stared at her with blazing eyes as he whispered,
"So you wish to go free?"
And as he asked this, she flinched as his arm threatened to release her into the water below, where nothing but death awaited. But he held tightly and went on.
"I warn you, princess," he said harshly. "With the power I command, my strength is inexhaustible, but my patience..."
He paused, lowering his eyes to the shadowy void below her.
"My patience grows weary quickly."
Rachel stammered, the words echoing off of the high stone ceiling over them. "I'm sorry." And at that, she was wrenched back from the ledge and pulled onto the pier, where she collapsed into his arms. Too stunned to realize, she accepted his soothing embrace as she trembled to regain her senses, and his arms closed around her, drawing her head to rest on his chest, and she was surprised for a moment to hear the low rhythm of a heartbeat within him. A gentle hand grazed through her hair, and she did not protest, for although her hatred of him was great, her fear of him was much stronger. For there, in the blackness of Rekos, Devane brandished the divine powers of the Dark Realm, and the longer she remained in the darkness, the more powerless she became against it.